Good afternoon, everybody. We're just going to give it about 1 more minute for people to sign on, and we'll be right back with you. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to GuideStar's 4th Impact Call of 2017, reporting out on our results from the 3rd quarter. My name is Gabe Cohen. I'm GuideStar's Senior Director of Marketing Communications, and thanks for joining us for a few minutes today. If this is your first Impact Call, welcome. And if this is your second Impact Call, or you've been to many before, welcome back. Just going to start with a few housekeeping items. And the first thing we want to talk about today is that the Impact Call is interactive. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask them right there in that the questions pane of the GoToWebinar interface at any point. Or you can also use the hashtag GSImpactCall on Twitter. And we're going to save some time at the end of today's webinar for those questions and answers. With that, I want to introduce our speakers today. First up with us is going to be our President and CEO, Jacob Harold, and then we're going to turn it over to our Vice President of Strategic Partnerships, Adrian Bordone, and then lastly, our Vice President of Strategy and Finance, Ms. Kusairi. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Jacob. Jacob, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Gabe. Really glad to be here, and thank you all for joining us. I will be quite brief today. Adrian and Ms. will be spending the bulk of our time providing some really interesting updates, and that's fundamentally what these impact calls are about. They are a mechanism for us at GuideStar to update you, our constituents, about what we've been doing, what we've been learning, what's been happening. And you know, we talk a lot here at GuideStar about transparency, and these impact calls are simply an attempt for us to walk that talk, to make sure we're not being hypocrites and that we ourselves are as transparent as we ask others to be. And so I will just take about 1 minute to remind those of you who may have already heard and to share with those of you who are new to our impact calls the basic outline of GuideStar's strategy. But again, just about 1 minute, and then I'll hand it over to the specifics for today's call. Next slide. So GuideStar sees our role as in the center of a supply chain of information about nonprofits. And this diagram essentially moves from the left to the right, where those on the left have information about social change, about the work that you all do. And then there are those on the far right who want that information. And it's our job to try and bridge that. Next, please. And so we start with information from nonprofits, which either goes through the IRS and the forms that nonprofits file with the IRS, or directly to GuideStar, and 144,000 nonprofits have come to GuideStar directly to provide additional information on top of what they share through the IRS to be able to control your own story. So if you're a nonprofit and you have not claimed your GuideStar profile and provided additional information, now's your chance to do exactly that and to ensure that your story is being told well, first on GuideStar's website, next please, which gets more than 8 million users each year. Whether individual donors, foundation staff, professionals, journalists, etc., or also through GuideStar's 219 platform partners, which include Facebook, Amazon, Google, Fidelity, Vanguard, Schwab, that use GuideStar's data on their own platforms. So for those of you in the audience who are leaders of nonprofits, our one request is to make sure that your GuideStar profile is up to date and that your story is being told throughout the supply chain in as effective and full a way as possible. And with that, I want to hand it over to my colleague Adrian to talk about how we've been taking all the data that we collect through these different processes and trying to find meaning in it. And not just the meaning that comes from an individual using one piece of information once, but the meaning that comes from looking at the data in aggregate and trying to understand the stories that come from that. So with that, let me hand it over to Adrian.
Thanks, Jacob. Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to be with you today. Welcome back to those who have who've attended other of our impact calls, and welcome for the first time to those new registrants and attendees. So we spend quite a bit of time here at GuideStar trying to, as Jacob mentioned, appropriately aggregate and disseminate the information that sector leaders and donors need to make informed decisions about giving and about strengthening the sector. Increasingly, we want to make sure not just that we are that sort of transactional center point, but that we are providing folks with the information they need in the format they need it to be able to inform that decision making. Some of you have seen this in other presentations that GuideStar has made, but this serves as a good touchstone, as a reminder to us at GuideStar and to the sector that independent of the angle from which you're trying to make giving decisions, whether you are an individual, an advisor to high net worth individuals, or a professional representative with a foundation, increasingly, as the Money for Good research tells us that we're looking at, there is a consistent set of data that you're seeking to meet your expectations in making giving decisions, and that is financial data and evidence of effectiveness across the board. Many of you, if you've been on our previous calls, will know the really significant effort that GuideStar has made in the last 18 months to strengthen our results data through our GuideStar Platinum Seal of Transparency, which Jacob sort of pointed to, that an organization can claim their profile and then go through the different seals of transparency and getting to Platinum, that highest seal where they can provide some evidence of their results. Today we're going to talk a little bit about that financial data, and as Jacob mentioned, the ability to look at a wide swath of data and determine what lessons we can learn as sector leaders locally and nationally. Next slide, Gabe. So we're really thrilled to be able to announce on today's call that our Financial Health of Philadelphia Area Nonprofits went live in October. It was sponsored by the Philadelphia Foundation and really was a bookend to, or the next chapter in, a series of efforts that we're doing. We'll have another national report released in December, but the Philadelphia report is something that we thought really helped remind us as practitioners with GuideStar and as leaders in the Philadelphia area how important it is to take a step back and look at the sector that we are striving to support, look at the mission accomplishment that we're seeking, and determine, are we sufficiently capitalized to be able to achieve the results that we're striving toward. The Philadelphia report that you see here was produced in partnership with Oliver Wyman and Sea Change Capital. Both of those partners, along with GuideStar, really helped frame this work, and we were able to put out what I think is a really high-quality report with the support, again, of the Philadelphia Foundation, Nadia Shmavonian, and other colleagues in Philadelphia. The lessons learned in this report, let's go to the next slide, Gabe. As you may imagine, some folks on today's call may be from a number of urban areas around the country where you have high density of nonprofit organizations. We recognize that the ability of an organization to have the capital it needs to succeed is really a mission deliverable element. Do we have the capacity to achieve the mission that sits before us? And as you can see in this little table here, we see that a lot of organizations in the sector today are really struggling to make that happen. The second column and third column compare both the New York City report that was released in late 2016 to the intelligence we gathered in our recent Philadelphia report. You might imagine, and certainly toward in the next few slides, I'll share with you how you can download a free copy of this report and maybe determine the degree to which you see lessons for your own community in the report that we produced for Philadelphia or New York City. But as you can see, some sobering intelligence and insights here. I'll mention two facts that sort of come out a little more in our lessons learned slide, Gabe, if you switch to the next page. We really see that below the numbers, which again are sobering, there's not only challenges that we face structurally as a sector, we often have very limited ways to recover from missteps or funding gaps. One of the most sort of relevant lessons learned that I found in the report, and that's been sort of prominently represented, is that noted in the second bullet here, a 5% reduction in government funding for Philadelphia area nonprofits would result in 20% of the nonprofits that currently earn a surplus move from a surplus to a deficit. We all know that we are in increasingly challenging times relative to public sector dollars and tax reform and quite a bit of movement that's going on in the nation's capital and elsewhere in states around the country. We know that the picture that we're painting from the research we did in Philadelphia with Sea Change and Oliver Wyman was really based on 2014 990 data. That was the last complete year when we started pulling this data to generate this report earlier this year. So we know that even today, the financial health of the Philadelphia area nonprofit organizations are even a little different than they were 12 to 14 to 16 months ago. We also know that at any time there is a reduction in government funding, it has quite a broad sort of impact on practitioners and organizations that are otherwise running a surplus. The last thing I'll note that I thought was particularly interesting is, if you look through this report and catch up with the executive summary, you'll see that it notes that an average of most nonprofits in the Philadelphia area that were healthy had an average of 10 weeks cash on hand to offset expenses. And while some of us can look at that and think, wow, that's a real luxury, when we're thinking about long-term mission accomplishment and the challenges we're trying to solve, and we're wondering whether we have enough capital on hand to keep the lights on 11 weeks from now, 12 weeks from now, essentially less than a full quarter's worth of business in the future, not only does that put an emotional strain on us as leaders and the individuals and staff and volunteers who dedicate their great work to us and the communities we serve, it often also really challenges us when we're thinking about next generation of talent from an acquisition perspective and from a retention perspective. So a lot of great insights in this report. It's about 10 to 12 pages long. It's got a fantastic executive summary, and then it's got a dozen or 15 pages of data included in the amendment. So very much encourage you to take a look. Gabe, let's switch to the next slide. If this is of interest to you, acknowledging that, hey, you may not be from Philadelphia, but you may see reflections of your community or lessons learned that might be relevant for your boards, your trustees, your stakeholders. You may want to share this with nonprofit organizations in your community or other giving and philanthropic organizations in your community. I will also say that we are in active dialogue with a number of other communities around the country. We will likely do 3 or 4 of these deep dives for other cities in 2018, and we're really excited to be able to make sure everyone on today's call will get a link to the national report that's in the final stages of review and will likely be published in early December. Gabe, let's either pause for questions or move on. Oh, great.
Yeah, I think we will turn it over to Ms. now, but I will just prompt everybody, if you have any questions, go ahead and ask them through that questions pane in the GoToWebinar interface, and then we'll get to them as soon as Ms. is done. So, Ms.?
Great. It was awesome to see, Adrian, in that final lessons learned, the kind of best practices around scenario planning, benchmarking, and setting targets are things that GuideStar does. So I'm glad to see that we are on the right path there, and I'm sure other nonprofits can also take lessons from what some of the best practices are. Shifting gears a bit here, as we dive into our programmatic results and financial results, I want to first set the stage on our theory of change, which is what you see here. From left to right, GuideStar's activities, we are one of many organizations that provide the supporting infrastructure for the nonprofit sector. So our activities are organized in the top right categories in blue. We hope that our activities lead to outcomes that are in the next column directly for our users around data-driven decisions, simplified fundraising systems, and faster learning among nonprofits that then yield those field-wide outcomes in yellow that you see on the far right. When we think about our activities and results, what I will be presenting to you the next few slides are the activities in the first column. Next slide, please. First, on data, how are our results there? The top chart shows you the growth of our data over time. That's at about 14%. Similarly, the quality of that data, as represented by the number of nonprofits sharing information across the different seal profile levels that both Adrian and Jacob mentioned, have also been continuing to grow over time. Most notably, our platinum level of transparency when nonprofits share programmatic results has grown nearly 10% quarter on quarter and is very promising to see. So you can access this information on GuideStar. Nonprofits can share that information throughout all their different constituents. Next slide, please. In terms of tools and resources, what you see here, just as a preview, will likely not be what you see next year. We've been continuing to refine the metrics that we track for these set of activities. I'll walk you through them really quickly, but here you see our monthly active users, our number of customers in each product category, and number of searches on GuideStar. They've stayed fairly constant throughout the year. One notable increase has been on the new customers in Q3 on our data services, and that's directly as a result of the release of our compensation report that was issued in September. And a last point on the number of searches, we're very glad that, at this 1-year mark since our new search tool was launched, in Q3 last year, the number of searches have grown 40%. So we believe that the increased functionality, the richer kind of search parameters that users have resulted in greater discovery of nonprofits. Next slide, please. In terms of our reach, all the metrics here you see in terms of our number of registered users, and the number of other platforms, the Amazons and Facebooks that Jacob mentioned, have all kind of grown over the course of the last 2 years. In particular, registered users has grown quite significantly, and we believe this is consistent with long-term trends that we're seeing for GuideStar overall. There was a slight downtick in Q3. You'll see in some of these numbers and also on the next slide, which is pretty common for us. There are some slower months in August due to the holidays. Next slide, please. The last slide on our programmatic results relates to our thought leadership, and we measure these in terms of blog views and posts as well as earned media. And you'll see that those Q3 seasonality is evident, except in the earned media. So there was a big uptick as a result of the disaster response and the need for advice from GuideStar that we saw in our earned media placements. Next slide, please. Shifting gears slightly to our financial results, and this is the second to last slide before we dig into those questions, so keep them coming. When we look at our financial results, you'll see here that the revenue numbers were lower than expected. So our actual revenue for Q3 are those bars in orange as compared to our budget and as compared to the same quarter last year. We had to conduct an exercise in terms of lowering our expenses so that we were able to maintain the change in unrestricted net assets as well as the change in total net assets, which were only slightly below budget. Last slide. These really dig into those financial metrics that were covered in the prior section as well. Our cash coverage ratio is over 2 times. We had set a target of 3 for ourselves, and we are not quite there. And so we are keeping an eye on the growth of our overall balance sheet, which is what you see in the top bar. But importantly, similar to all of you, we also closely monitor our cash position. That is all I have.
Great. Thanks, Miz. We are going to jump over to questions now. And the first question we got today was from Laura, and she said that she missed the number of users that GuideStar has, and she was asking if it was 22 million. I'll take a quick shot at answering that, and it's a little bit of an inexact science, but we know how many users come to GuideStar.org every year, and that number is going to be 8 to 9 million at the end of 2017. And that's unique users that are coming to our site throughout the year. Where it gets a little bit tricky to calculate is when we start to talk about that network of different platforms and apps and websites that are powered with GuideStar data, the Facebooks, Amazon Smiles, and so on and so forth. We know, working with our partners, that there's probably we know of about another 10 million for sure that are then seeing that data, but what we don't know is exactly how far that information goes and exactly how many people it reaches. So we do think that it's probably in the tens of millions of users each year that are making decisions about their charitable giving based on GuideStar data, and that's really something that we're trying to hammer down on over the next year or so. But yeah, so there's a little bit of an inexact science that goes into it, but great question, Laura. Eugene was just asking if we could restate the website. So what we're going to do is we pinged that out to everybody in the little chat functionality, but just so you know, if anybody doesn't have that chat functionality open, it's learn.guidestar.org/products/Philadelphia-nonprofits-financial-help. Yep, so don't listen to any of that and just go to the chat functionality and click on it. It's going to be much easier. We'll also send out a follow-up email that has that link as well. Greg has a question here that I think would be good for you, Jacob. Do GuideStar tools for philanthropists provide a GICS-like sector and subsector search with giving and budgetary need data sets?
So it's a good question, and I'm seeing here Greg continues, noting that as a philanthropist, he wants to target his giving to organizations within subsectors, and also to those that really need money and meet his high management standards. So the answer is mostly yes. So GuideStar search tools do allow you to break down by an issue taxonomy. Greg mentions GICS, which is the Global Industry Classification Standards, just a way of breaking down businesses. There's something similar in the nonprofit community called the National Taxonomy of Exempt Entities. You don't have to worry about any of that. Just know that if you want to look up by education or health, you're able to do that. And we have a number of mechanisms we're using to try to continue to make that categorization stronger. So definitely yes there. And then second, by geography, that's quite easy to do using the GuideStar search tools. And then thirdly, by budget size, yes, as well, easy to set whatever parameters you want to, minimum and maximum, to be able to get to what are all the homeless shelters between $1 and $5 million within the state of Nebraska. That can be done in a few seconds. But Greg also asks about budgetary needs. That's a little bit harder because it's hard to define. We do collect information from nonprofits where they qualitatively describe, here are some things we need to do our work better. But there's no easy formula to say that a particular organization needs $100,000 this year, but another one needs $5 million. So that's something you can indirectly try and figure out from an organization's financials, but we don't quite have that. But between the issue categorization, the geographic categorization, and the size categorization, you can very quickly get to a really useful subset of organizations in whatever way is appropriate to a particular donor's needs.
Great. We have another question here from Karen. How are you defining data points? What does that mean exactly? Jacob, you want to take a shot at that?
Yeah, sure. So essentially, we mean a individual piece of information that might be relevant to a donor or another stakeholder. So, for example, a given nonprofit's total revenue in 2015 would be a single data point. If you also had their revenue in 2016 and 17, that would be 3 data points. And so as the information operates on many dimensions across different organizations, different periods of time, and different pieces of information, the data point is one individual one that kind of at the intersection of all those. So again, that total is about 3.4 billion. Now, sometimes we have colleagues at GuideStar who don't like us talking about that because they say, and they're absolutely right, that some of those data points are a lot more relevant than others. You know, the name of a nonprofit's auditor in 1997 is probably less relevant than an articulation of their goals in 2016. And what we want to do is offer as many different kinds of information so that donors and other constituents are able to answer the questions that they have. But, you know, all those pieces of information are going to be relevant for somebody, but some of them are going to be relevant for a lot more people.
Great. Quentin just chimed in with a question about if the recording is going to be available, and my apologies for not stating this up front. Everybody will get a follow-up email that has some of the resources that we've talked about today, as well as a recording of the presentation. So, Quentin, thank you for keeping me on my toes with that. Jennifer is asking if we can share more information about the grant application feature that we offer. Jacob, is that something that you want to talk a little bit about, GuideStar for grant applications?
Sure. So, you know, anyone who has worked in nonprofit fundraising is familiar with the phenomenon of having to answer the same question over and over and over again from different funders, whether they're individuals or more often institutional funders like foundations or government agencies or corporate donors. And that there's just a lot of waste in that. Why do you have to keep entering in your address over and over again? Especially when all of these funders rely on computers to gather the information and often to make their decisions. And that's why GuideStar has made a real push to try and have our information automatically show up in the software packages that funders use, which are called grant management software programs. And so most of the major vendors who build that kind of software used by foundations and many others have signed agreements with GuideStar to have our information flow in automatically. We call that GuideStar for Grants, and it is not a true common application the way you have for applying to college, for example. But it is a step in that direction. It begins to streamline that process of applying for money. It's going to take years and years for us to really rationalize this system, but it feels like a big step forward. And we've been pleased that dozens of foundations are already using this technology, and many more will be joining soon. So it's a big step, but it's on a long road towards a system that really makes sense and where nonprofit staff and volunteers can really focus their attention on the work and not just on paperwork.
Great. We have a question here from Steve about how many hits from foundations we get each year. I can't exactly answer that, Steve, but what we can answer is how many foundation users we have. And that number is in the tens of thousands, about 40,000 foundation users that we know are coming to our site every year and are kind of in our system, subscribe to our newsletters and that sort of thing. So a fairly high amount of foundations are relying on GuideStar at some part of their grant-making process.
And one thing, Gabe, I'll just add to that is that we also know that many of our very heaviest users, the ones who are using GuideStar hundreds of times in a given week even, are often foundation staff.
Yeah, I was at a foundation conference last week, TAG, down in New Orleans, and it's my favorite thing to do to go to a foundation conference because I just say that I work for GuideStar, and they immediately say, "Oh, we love GuideStar so much, we use you all the time." So it's a great ego boost. I can't think of a better note to end on than that. So thank you, everybody, for your time today. We appreciate your questions. We didn't get to every single question today. Lots of questions came in. So we'll follow up with you individually if we didn't get a chance to already. Stay tuned. We'll have our first impact call of Q1 in early 2018, our first impact call of 2018 in Q1. So stay tuned for more information on that. And thanks, everybody. Good luck this Giving Tuesday and giving season to all those nonprofits out there as well.